The newspaper clippings yellowed and cracked like autumn leaves, their final headlines screaming about a gas leak at the old Morrison factory. April 15th, 1975. The day the presses stopped rolling in Millbrook Valley. The day the world forgot. A town existed, but the town kept living, breathing, growing in the spaces between documented moments. In the silence where official history stopped listening, I found this place by accident, following a GPS error that led me down a county road that shouldn't exist on any modern map. The asphalt was perfect, newly paved with fresh yellow lines. Yet the cars parked along Main Street belonged to decades I barely remembered from childhood photographs. A pristine 1987 Honda Civic sat next to a spotless 2003 Ford Explorer, next to a gleaming 2019 Tesla Model 3. All immaculate, all somehow wrong, like museum pieces arranged by someone who understood the aesthetics of different eras, but had never actually lived through them. The people waved as I passed through their downtown district. Normal waves, friendly waves. The kind small-town folks give to strangers who might bring news from the outside world. But their eyes held something else entirely. A recognition that shouldn't exist. A knowledge that I was expected, even though I'd never been here before. Even though this town doesn't appear on any map made after Gerald Ford was president. Even though the last postal route through here was discontinued when disco was still popular and personal computers were science fiction. I parked outside the Millbrook Public Library, a solid brick building that looked exactly like every Carnegie Library should look. Classical revival architecture with limestone trim, wide steps leading to heavy oak doors, tall windows that promised the musty comfort of old books and older secrets. Inside, Eleanor Whitmore smiled from behind the circulation desk, her silver hair perfectly styled in a way that suggested weekly appointments at a beauty parlor that had probably closed during the Reagan administration. Her cardigan was the color of autumn leaves, hand-knitted with a pattern that spoke of evenings spent in front of television shows that had been cancelled before cable existed. She knew my name before I introduced myself. She knew I was looking for answers about the newspaper clippings, about the strange gap in recorded history that had brought me down roads that shouldn't exist to find a place that officially ended decades ago. She knew because she'd been waiting 48 years for someone like me to arrive. Someone from the outside world who would notice what everyone else had forgotten. The microfilm reader hummed with the distinctive sound of machinery from an era when information was still physical, when research required patience and manual dexterity rather than keyword searches. Eleanor loaded the reels with practiced efficiency, her movements suggesting decades of helping researchers navigate the boundary between what was recorded and what was remembered. Every local newspaper, perfectly preserved, perfectly indexed, perfectly maintained despite the absence of any funding source that could be traced through normal, bureaucratic channels. The Millbrook Valley Gazette ran from 1892 to April 15th, 1975. Then nothing. Complete silence. As if the town simply stopped existing to the outside world on that spring day when 23 people died in an industrial accident that history forgot. That insurance companies never processed. That federal agencies never investigated. The kind of tragedy that should have made national news, that should have triggered safety investigations, that should have left a paper trail stretching from local courthouse to Washington, D.C., but Eleanor remembered. She remembered the day after. The accident when the survivors gathered in the high school gymnasium to plan funerals that no mortician outside the valley would handle. She remembered the day after that, when they realized that telephone calls to relatives in other states weren't going through, that letters mailed to addresses they'd written to for years were being returned as undeliverable. 48 years of days that never made it into any newspaper, never got recorded in any official record, never happened according to the world beyond the valley's borders. 48 years of birthdays celebrated with cakes baked in ovens that no utility company acknowledges powering. 48 years of funerals conducted in a cemetery that doesn't appear on county land records. 48 years of marriages performed by ministers whose credentials aren't recognized by any denomination, whose signatures on marriage certificates carry no legal weight beyond the valley's borders. 48 years of children born and raised in a town that time abandoned, who grew up learning to read from books that were never ordered, never shipped, never paid for through any traceable transaction. "You'll want to speak with Thomas," Eleanor whispered, her voice carrying the weight of decades spent explaining the unexplainable to the few outsiders who found their way here. "He's been documenting everything since the day the outside world stopped listening. Every birth certificate they won't accept, every death certificate they won't file, every life they pretend never happened, every moment they refuse to acknowledge. This is that documentation. This is the story of Millbrook Valley, where the newspaper clippings stop in 1975, but the town remembers everything after. This is the story of what happens when a place becomes unstuck from recorded time, floating in the space between what was officially documented and what continues to be lived. This is the story of a community that chose to exist without permission, without recognition, without the outside world's acknowledgement that they had the right to continue breathing after history stopped watching them breathe. The afternoon light, filtering through the library's tall windows, carried the golden quality of late autumn, though my car's dashboard had read 72 degrees when I parked, and the trees outside showed the full green of midsummer. Time moved differently here. I was beginning to understand. Not faster or slower, but sideways, parallel to the normal flow of minutes and hours, existing in the spaces between seconds where most people never thought to look. Eleanor closed the microfilm reader with reverent care, as if she were handling sacred relics rather than newspaper archives. "The last headline," she said, pointing to the final edition, "was about the Morrison factory explosion. 23 dead, they said. But they were wrong about the number. Everyone in town died that day. We just didn't stop living. Signed, ... by me." Though I was beginning to suspect that signature had been written in ink that dried decades before I was born, in handwriting that looked like mine but belonged to someone who had visited this place in a different era, in a different relationship with time, in a different understanding of what it meant to exist between the documented moments of official history. Welcome back to the creepy journal, where the stories we uncover might be closer to home than you think, where the line between what's documented and what's real grows thinner with every investigation. If you're new here, we explore the places where reality bends and time forgets to move forward in the orderly progression that calendars and clocks insist upon. We find the gaps in official history where life continues without permission, where communities exist in the spaces between documented moments. Subscribe before you find yourself in a town that remembers you, even when the world doesn't remember. It exists. Hit that notification bell, because some stories only find you once, and some places only appear to people who are ready to question whether existence requires official recognition. Ring that bell before you discover that the road you're driving leads to places that don't appear on any map made after the year you were born. The Millbrook Valley Historical Society occupied a Queen Anne Victorian house on Elm Street. its wraparound porch sagging under the weight of clematis vines that bloomed out of season, displaying flowers from spring, summer, and autumn simultaneously, in a riot of temporal confusion that somehow looked natural, inevitable, beautiful in its impossibility. The paint on the shutters was fresh, but in colors that hadn't been popular since the Eisenhower administration. The mailbox bore no postal route number, no zip code, no indication that any mail carrier had serviced this address in the past half-century. Thomas Hartwell met me at the door, a man in his 70s with eyes that belonged to someone much older, someone who had witnessed decades of impossible events and learned to accept them as normal variations in the pattern of existence. He'd been the town historian since 1973. He told me, settling into the role 2 years before everything changed. He'd been keeping records since the day the official records stopped mattering. Since the day the outside world decided that Millbrook Valley had concluded its story and closed its chapter in the larger Book of American Small Towns. Inside, filing cabinets lined every wall, stretching from floor to ceiling in formations that suggested organic growth rather than planned organization. Handwritten documentation of 5 decades that officially never happened, meticulously maintained despite the absence of any historical society budget, any grant funding, any institutional support that could be traced through normal bureaucratic channels. Birth certificates for children born in 1976, 1981, 1995, 2003, 2018, all handwritten on official forms that had somehow remained in supply despite no traceable ordering process. Marriage licenses for couples who fell in love in a town that didn't exist according to state records, whose unions carried no legal weight beyond the valley's borders but were honored with the same solemnity as any ceremony conducted unofficially. Recognized locations, death certificates for people who died in a place the world forgot, whose passing was mourned by communities that don't appear on census records, whose graves were dug in cemetery plots that no deed office acknowledges, whose headstones were carved by stonemasons whose businesses had no official licenses, no tax identification numbers, no record of purchasing materials or maintaining equipment. The state won't process them, Thomas explained, pulling out drawer after drawer of meticulous paperwork that would have impressed any bureaucrat, if bureaucrats were allowed to acknowledge its existence. Social Security doesn't recognize births. Here, the IRS has no record of our businesses operating, our residents earning income, our property changing hands. We exist in a bubble, completely cut off from the administrative reality of America. But we're still here. We're still living. We're still creating the documents that prove we exist, even if no one outside the valley will accept them as proof. The hallways of Thomas's house stretched longer than they should, defying the architectural logic suggested by the building's exterior dimensions. They were lined with photographs that documented decades of life, decades of moments that had been lived fully, even if they'd never been officially recorded. High school graduations from Millbrook High, class of 76, 82, 91, 2005, 2020, each ceremony conducted with the full pomp and circumstance of any American graduation, complete with valedictorian speeches, proud parents, and graduates who would discover that their diplomas carried no weight in college admissions processes because the school that issued them had no official accreditation after 1975. The school building was the same in every photo, but the faces changed, aged, evolved through hairstyles and fashion that somehow reached this forgotten corner of reality. Despite the town's isolation from normal cultural transmission networks, Teenagers in the 1980s wore the same styles their peers did in officially recognized towns. Despite having no access to the magazines, television shows, or peer networks that typically spread fashion trends, children in the 1990s played with toys that were popular nationwide, despite the absence of any retail outlets that could be traced through normal distribution channels. "Look at this," Thomas said, pointing to a wedding photo from 1987 displayed in a frame that somehow maintained its silver polish despite decades of handling. Catherine Wells married Robert Hayes at the Methodist Church on a Saturday in June. She was 23, beautiful as summer morning, wore her grandmother's dress that had been altered by Mrs. Peterson, who ran the dress shop until she passed. In '94, beautiful ceremony. The whole town attended, brought covered dishes, danced until midnight to music played by the Hartley Brothers Band. He flipped through a leather album filled with reception photos that captured every detail of a celebration that had been lived fully despite its official non-existence. Cake cutting performed with the same joy as any wedding cake had ever been cut. First dance executed with the same romance as any couple had ever shared. Children playing on the church lawn, while adults lingered over coffee and conversation that stretched into evening shadows. They divorced in 1994, Thomas continued, his voice carrying the matter-of-fact tone of someone recounting local history that everyone in town remembered. Messy affair, like divorces always are. She kept the house on Maple Street, started working at the hotel. He took over his father's position at the bank, though by then the bank wasn't processing any transactions that the outside world would recognize. Still, people needed somewhere to keep their money safe, someone to help them buy houses and cars, someone to maintain the financial structures that communities require. I studied the photos with growing fascination. They looked real because they were real. The emotions were genuine because people had genuinely felt them. The aging was consistent because time had actually passed, even if that time hadn't been officially recorded, but according to every database I could access from my phone. Catherine Wells hadn't existed after 1975. Robert Hayes had been a bank manager who died in the Morrison factory incident, according to the last newspaper report filed about the tragedy. Yet, here they were, documented in Kodak prints and Polaroids that had aged appropriately, their colors fading in patterns consistent with the passage of decades, living full lives in a town that time forgot, but that hadn't forgotten how to live. Creating memories that would never be validated by official history, but that were as real as any memories created in places that appeared on maps. The windows in Thomas's house showed different views from each room, as if the building existed in multiple time periods simultaneously. The living room looked out onto Main Street as it appeared in 2023, complete with modern cars whose license plates bore numbers that no DMV had issued, LED streetlights that no electrical company had installed, crosswalk signals that no traffic authority had approved. The kitchen window revealed the same street, but the cars were from the 1980s, boxy and chrome-heavy, parked in front of businesses that displayed prices and products from that era. The study window showed Main Street in the 1990s, when the hardware store had expanded into the adjacent building, when the Methodist Church had added its education wing, when the town had installed its first and only traffic light at the intersection of Main and Elm. The bathroom window revealed a view from 2010, when someone had painted new lines in the parking spaces, when the library had somehow acquired computers that no technology budget had funded, when solar panels had appeared on rooftops despite the absence of any green energy. Initiatives that could be traced through official channels. Time moves differently here, Thomas said when he noticed me moving from window to window, trying to understand the chronological impossibility of what I was seeing. We age normally. We live normally. Our bodies follow the same biological clocks as everyone else's, but we exist in all the years simultaneously. The town remembers every moment since 1975, all at once. Past, present, and future blend together like watercolors in the rain, creating something beautiful and impossible and absolutely real. Staff at the various businesses changed faces depending on when you visited them, cycling through different periods of their employment, different stages of their lives in the town. The young woman working at the gas station in the morning would be middle-aged by afternoon, elderly by evening, not aging in real time, but cycling through different periods of her existence in the community. She remembered every version of herself, every year she'd worked there, every customer she'd served across 5 decades of existence that officially never happened, but had been lived with complete authenticity. The impossibility wasn't disturbing. It was simply another aspect of life in a place that had learned to exist without official permission, where the normal rules of documented time had been replaced by something more flexible, more accommodating, more human in its willingness to let people exist in whatever temporal relationship felt most natural to them. Sarah's corner diner occupied the same red brick building it had since 1952, but the conversations inside reset and looped like a broken record player, overlapping across decades in patterns that created a strange harmony of human experience, stretching across generations. The chrome coffee machine gleamed with the attention of someone who had been polishing it daily for 48 years. The checkered linoleum floor showed wear patterns that suggested decades of foot traffic, but the wear was evenly distributed, as if the same number of people had been walking the same paths for the same amount of time, year after year, in a rhythm that never varied. I sat at the counter, ordering coffee from Sarah Mitchell, a woman who appeared to be in her 60s, but spoke about events from every decade since 1975, as if they'd happened yesterday, as if time were a filing system where she could access any drawer with equal ease, where chronology was a convenience rather than a constraint. Her movements behind the counter suggested muscle memory developed over decades of serving the same customers. But those customers included people who should have died, people who shouldn't have been born yet, people who existed in the spaces between documented moments. Just last week, she said, wiping down the chrome coffee machine with a cloth that somehow stayed white despite constant use. Dr. Cross came in for his usual black coffee, wheat toast, no butter, same order every Tuesday for 30 years, never varied once in all that time. You could set your watch by Dr. Cross and his Tuesday morning routine. She poured my coffee with practiced efficiency, the stream forming a perfect arc from pot to cup, never spilling a drop despite the thousands of times she'd performed this same motion. Strange thing though, he mentioned he was worried about that Morrison factory, said he'd been treating too many workers for respiratory problems, symptoms that didn't match any of the standard industrial ailments he'd learned about in medical school. Thought maybe they should investigate the ventilation system, maybe bring in some experts from the state health department. I nearly choked on my coffee, the bitter liquid burning as it went down wrong. Dr. Benjamin Cross, he died in the factory. Accident in 1975. Sarah looked at me with the patient expression of someone explaining something obvious to a confused child. The same look teachers give students who haven't been paying attention during important lessons. That was last Tuesday. Honey, he always comes in on Tuesdays, has for decades. though now that you mention it, I haven't seen him since the accident. Terrible thing, that explosion. 23 people dead, including poor Dr. Cross. He was trying to help when the second blast went off. Always trying to help. That man. The conversation continued. But the timeline made no sense, according to the linear logic I'd grown up accepting as natural law. She spoke about Dr. Cross's visits in present tense, describing his coffee preferences and conversation topics as ongoing realities. Then she acknowledged his death in past tense, mourning his loss with genuine grief that felt fresh despite the decades that had passed. Then she mentioned seeing his widow at the grocery store just yesterday, discussing plans for their golden wedding anniversary that they'd never get to celebrate. The widow who had also died in 1987, according to Thomas's meticulously maintained records, in a car accident on a road that no longer appeared on any official maps, mourned by a community that had no legal standing to issue death certificates, buried in a cemetery that no county office acknowledged. Other customers filtered in and out, their conversations overlapping across decades in ways that created a strange temporal symphony. A young woman in a 1980s-style dress discussed her pregnancy. Due date in November 1983. Excitedly planning a nursery for a child who would grow up in a town that didn't officially exist, who would attend schools that had no accreditation, who would receive diplomas that carried no official weight. Her excitement was genuine, her anticipation real, her love for her unborn child as powerful as any parent's love had ever been. An elderly man in overalls complained about the new speed limit signs installed in 2001, grumbling about changes that had disrupted traffic patterns that had worked perfectly fine for decades. His frustration was authentic, his attachment to the old ways sincere, his resistance to change as human as any elderly person's resistance to modifications in familiar environments. A middle-aged couple planned their anniversary dinner for a restaurant that had closed in 1989 but somehow still took reservations, still served meals prepared by chefs who had died years ago, still maintained the romantic atmosphere that had made it the preferred destination for special occasions. Throughout the 1980s, their love was evident in the way they looked at each other, their history visible in shared glances and comfortable silences, their relationship as real as any marriage that had been officially recorded and legally recognized. The thing about living in a place time forgot, Sarah said, refilling my cup with coffee that somehow stayed at the perfect temperature despite the pot sitting on a burner that no electric company powered, is that time doesn't forget us. It just gets confused about when we're supposed to be. We remember everything: births, deaths, celebrations, tragedies, first days of school, last days of work, the big moments and the small ones. But we remember them all as if they're happening. Now, past tense doesn't exist here. Everything is present tense. Everything is immediate. Everything is right now. A construction worker at the end of the counter mentioned finishing the new wing at the elementary school, discussing the project in present tense as if the cement was still wet, as if the building permits were still being processed, as if the school board meetings to approve the expansion were scheduled for next week rather than having been concluded 32 years ago. The project had been completed in 1991. According to the faded newspaper clipping Sarah showed me, but to him it was current work. Today's work. The cement was still wet in his memory, the satisfaction of completion still fresh, the pride of craftsmanship still immediate and present. The diner's jukebox played songs from every era since 1975. but the patrons requested them as if they were current hits, as if the radio had just premiered them last week, as if the artists were still touring and making television appearances. Someone fed quarters into the machine and selected Don't Stop Believing as if Journey had just released it, as if the song hadn't become a cultural touchstone played at sporting events and graduation ceremonies for decades. Another customer complained that they played too much of that new Madonna song, referring to Like a Virgin from 1984 as if it were dominating current airwaves, as if MTV was still in its infancy, as if the cultural landscape of the mid-1980s were the present moment rather than a historical period that most people remembered with nostalgia. The clock on the wall showed different times depending on the angle you viewed it from, creating temporal perspectives that somehow all felt correct. Straight on, it read to 30 p.m., the afternoon light confirming that assessment. From the left side, Les 11:45 ham, and the coffee did taste like morning coffee, fresh and urgent. From the right, 6:20 p.m., and the dinner crowd was indeed beginning to filter in, discussing evening plans and weekend activities. But everyone accepted whatever time they saw as the correct time for their particular moment in the town's extended present. The way people in different time zones accept that it can be noon in New York and 9 a.m. in Los Angeles simultaneously. Except here, the time zones existed in the same physical space, occupying the same diner, served by the same staff who existed in all the time periods at once. The luggage in the Millbrook's lobby belonged to guests who had checked in across 5 decades, but the registration cards were all dated within the last week, written in handwriting that varied from the careful cursive taught in 1950s schools to the hasty printing favored by people who had learned to write on computer keyboards. Suitcases from the 1970s sat next to modern rolling bags with TSA-approved locks, all tagged with arrival dates that made no chronological sense but were accepted by staff as perfectly normal variations in the check-in process. A leather valise with brass corners, the kind traveling salesman carried in 1978 when briefcases were still built to last lifetimes, bore a check-in tag dated 3 days ago in blue ballpoint pen that had faded to the pale grey that indicated decades of exposure to fluorescent lighting. The leather showed appropriate wear for a piece that had been traveling for 45 years, but the guest who owned it had supposedly arrived on Tuesday, checked in with a credit card that no financial institution would recognize, and requested a room on the 2nd floor overlooking the garden that hadn't been planted until 1983, a high-tech aluminum case with electronic locks and wheels that rolled with the whisper-quiet precision of modern engineering, clearly manufactured sometime in the 2010s when travel gear had become both more sophisticated and more standardized, showed an arrival date from last month written in pencil on cardstock that had yellowed appropriately for something that had been exposed to sunlight streaming through lobby windows for decades. Margaret Stone, the hotel receptionist, treated all the luggage as current, as belonging to guests who were actively staying at the hotel, whose needs had to be accommodated, whose reservations were valid regardless of the temporal impossibilities their presence represented. She had worked at the hotel since 1974, she told me, hired fresh out of high school by a manager who had died in the Morrison factory accident, but who had somehow continued to conduct staff meetings every Monday morning until he retired in 1987, and was replaced by his assistant, who had also died in the accident, but had learned the hotel business during the 23 years between her death and her promotion. Mr. Patterson left his bag when he went to dinner, Margaret explained. pointing to a hardshell Samsonite from 1982 that bore the wear. Patterns of extensive travel, but looked as if it had been manufactured yesterday. The plastic somehow retaining its original color despite decades of handling. Said he'd be back by 8 o'clock. Wanted us to hold his table at the restaurant for tomorrow night. Though that was Tuesday, and today's. She paused, consulting multiple calendars on her desk, each showing different months and years, each marked with appointments and reservations that stretched back to 1975 and forward to dates that hadn't occurred yet. The calendars overlapped like geological strata, creating a chronological confusion that Margaret navigated with the expertise of someone who had been managing temporal paradoxes for nearly 50 years. Well, it's definitely Tuesday, she concluded with the confidence of someone who had learned to trust her instincts about time rather than relying on external authorities to define when she was supposed to exist. In room 237, I found a wristwatch that ticked backwards. Its mechanism somehow reversed so that time flowed in the wrong direction, while maintaining the precise timing that Swiss craftsmanship promised. Not the hands moving counterclockwise, which would have been merely eccentric, but time itself flowing in reverse. The digital date display counting down through recent history. January 15th, 2023. January 14th, 2023. January 13th, 2023. Each day that passed on the watch's face represented a day moving backward through the calendar, creating a personal timeline that ran counter to everyone else's experience. The watch belonged to a guest who had supposedly checked in yesterday, but claimed to have been staying at the hotel since 1989, paying for his room with cash that bore the appropriate printing and serial numbers for currency from different decades, somehow maintaining an account balance that no bank would acknowledge but that the hotel accepted as legitimate payment for services rendered. Room service arrived before guests ordered it, appearing at doors with meals that perfectly matched preferences that hadn't been expressed yet, delivered by staff who somehow knew what people wanted to eat before those people had realized they were hungry. Margaret showed me the logbook, filled with meal deliveries that preceded their requests by hours, sometimes days, creating a system of service that operated on anticipated need rather than expressed demand. Mrs. Rodriguez always orders the chicken Caesar salad on Thursday afternoons, Margaret said, pointing to an entry written in handwriting that belonged to multiple decades, the ink shifting from blue ballpoint to black fountain pen to pencil, depending on the light. So we just send it up when we know she's thinking about it. Usually works out perfectly. She's been ordering the same meal every Thursday since 1987, so we've had plenty of time to perfect the timing. The television in the lobby showed news broadcasts from every year since 1975, switching channels seemingly at random but somehow maintaining narrative coherence, as if all the news from 5 decades were part of the same ongoing story. Different chapters in the same extended report about how America had changed and stayed the same since the last time the outside world had paid attention to Millbrook Valley. Walter Cronkite announced the fall of Saigon with the gravitas that had made him America's most trusted news anchor, his voice carrying across the lobby with the authority of someone reporting events that mattered, that would be remembered, that would change the world in ways that were still being calculated. Immediately following, without commercial interruption or station identification, Dan Rather reported on the Challenger disaster, his professional composure cracking slightly as he conveyed news that had shocked a nation, that had reminded America that progress came with risks, that dreams could explode in clear blue skies. CNN's coverage of 9/11s followed seamlessly. The footage as raw and immediate as it had been on that September morning when the world discovered that safety was an illusion. That distance was no protection from hatred. That modern life carried vulnerabilities that previous generations hadn't imagined. Then coverage of the 2020 election. The polarization and uncertainty of a democracy testing its own resilience. Followed by reporting on events that hadn't happened yet, but somehow seemed inevitable, as if the future were as accessible to the television as the past. All the broadcasts were live, present tense, happening now in the extended moment that was Millbrook Valley's relationship with time. The anchors spoke with the urgency of people reporting breaking news, even when they were describing events that had been analyzed and contextualized and remembered for decades. Photographs on the walls aged backwards, their subjects getting progressively younger each time I looked at them, as if time were flowing in reverse for the people captured in the frames while moving forward for everything else. Wedding pictures from 1985 showed the couple getting younger with each viewing, their faces losing the subtle lines that marked their passage through their 20s, their clothing styles shifting to earlier fashions, their expressions becoming more innocent, more hopeful, more trusting in the future's benevolence. Eventually, they appeared as teenagers, then children, then the photographs simply showed empty frames, as if they were waiting for people who hadn't been born yet. Placeholder images for lives that were still being planned by parents who were still children themselves, still learning to exist in a town that time had abandoned, but that hadn't abandoned. The hope of creating new generations. The hotel's guest registry contained signatures in ink that changed color over time. Names written in blue ballpoint pen, slowly shifting to black fountain pen, then to pencil, then fading entirely while somehow remaining visible. Like impressions left on paper that could only be read by running your finger across the page, feeling the words rather than seeing them. The signatures themselves told stories of people passing through, staying temporarily in a place that had become permanently temporary, existing in the space between departure and arrival, between leaving one life and beginning another, between being documented and being forgotten. In the gift shop, postcards displayed images of Millbrook Valley from different decades. The same street corner photographed in 1976, 1983, 1991, 1999, 2005, 2014, 2021, each image capturing the town's evolution through small changes that somehow added up to continuity, showing how places could change completely, while remaining essentially the same. But when guests purchased the postcards to mail to relatives in the outside world, the postal service returned them stamped address, unknown or undeliverable, as if the town existed enough to be photographed, enough to produce merchandise, enough to maintain a post office that sold stamps and processed mail, but not enough for letters to find their way beyond the valley's borders, not enough for communication, to bridge the gap between documented reality and lived experience. The third floor of the Millbrook Inn didn't appear on the elevator buttons during normal operation, but the elevator sometimes stopped there anyway, its doors opening with the soft chime that indicated arrival at a destination that shouldn't exist. The opening revealed a hallway that stretched infinitely in both directions, defying the architectural constraints of the building's exterior dimensions, lined with room numbers that followed no logical sequence that any mathematician or architect would recognize. Room 847 sat next to room 23, which neighbored room 1456, the numbers appearing to have been assigned by someone who understood a different kind of order. A system based on principles that hadn't been taught in any engineering school, but that felt intuitively correct to people who had learned to exist outside normal temporal frameworks. The carpet was deep burgundy, patterned with gold flowers that seemed to move when viewed peripherally, creating the impression of a garden that existed only in the corner of one's vision, that disappeared when looked at directly but returned when attention moved elsewhere. Catherine Wells, now working as the hotel's real estate liaison after her divorce from Robert Hayes had been finalized by a legal system that no state bar association recognized, warned guests about the third floor, with the concern of someone who had learned to respect dangers that couldn't be explained in normal terms. Her voice carried an edge of anxiety that hadn't been present in her wedding photos from 1987. The kind of worry that develops in people who have witnessed things that shouldn't happen, but that happen anyway. That challenge fundamental assumptions about how reality is supposed to work. Sometimes the elevator gets confused, she explained, her hand smoothing the fabric of a dress that looked contemporary but was cut in a style that suggested fashion from multiple decades, as if she existed in several time periods simultaneously, and her clothing reflected that temporal complexity. Time layers differently up there. The rooms contain moments from before the accident, and visiting them can ... complicate your relationship with when you're supposed to be. People have gone up there and come back changed, not older or younger, exactly, but existing in a different relationship with their own timeline. Light blinked in specific rhythms from behind the third floor's windows, visible from the street in patterns that suggested communication, but in a code that no one had been able to decipher despite decades of observation and analysis. From Main Street, you could see the sequence clearly. 3 quick flashes, pause, 7 slow pulses, pause, 2 rapid blinks, then darkness for exactly 47 seconds before the entire sequence repeated with mechanical precision. Locals had been counting the pattern for decades, documenting it in notebooks that filled filing cabinets in Thomas Hartwell's Historical Society, creating charts and graphs and statistical analyses that revealed the mathematical perfection of the sequence, but provided no insight into its meaning or purpose. The flashes corresponded to no known code, no decipherable message, no pattern that related to Morse code or maritime signals or any system of communication that had been developed for normal human use. Some people theorized that the lights were trying to communicate with someone or something outside the valley, sending messages to recipients who no longer existed or who hadn't been born yet. Others believed the pattern was a countdown, marking time until some event that would either restore the town's connection to normal reality or sever it completely, leaving Millbrook Valley to exist entirely outside the flow of documented time. The elevator only accessed the third floor under specific conditions that no one fully understood, but that everyone recognized when they occurred. Like the moment just before a thunderstorm, when the air pressure changes and people feel weather coming before they see clouds. Some guests reported that the floor appeared when they desperately needed to remember something from before 1975, when they were trying to access memories that predated the accident, that existed in the time when the town had been part of normal reality. Others claimed the third floor manifested when they were trying to forget something that happened after the accident, when they needed to escape from the burden of existing in a place that time had abandoned, when the weight of living without official recognition became too heavy to bear, and they needed to remember what it felt like to exist in a world that acknowledged their presence. The elevator operator, an ancient man named James Parker, who had worked at the hotel since 1962 and who somehow continued to operate machinery that no inspector had certified, No insurance company had covered, no maintenance service had repaired, simply shrugged when asked about the pattern that determined when the third floor became accessible. "Floor comes when it wants to come," James said, polishing the brass elevator buttons with a cloth that somehow stayed clean despite decades of use, despite the constant handling by guests whose existence left no trace in any official record. "Been trying to figure it out since the day after the accident. Sometimes I think the elevator knows things about time that we don't. Sometimes I think time uses our elevator to move between moments, like we're some kind of temporal transit system that connects different periods in the town's history." His hands moved over the controls with the muscle memory of someone who had been performing the same motions for 60 years. But the elevator responded to his touch in ways that defied mechanical logic. Sometimes pressing the button for the second floor would take passengers to the basement. Sometimes the ground floor button would deliver them to the roof, where they could see the entire valley spread out below them, showing different seasons. Simultaneously, spring in the north, summer in the east, autumn in the south, winter in the west, behind the doors of the third floor rooms. Mirrors reflected different realities, showing versions of Millbrook Valley that existed in parallel to the one that visitors experienced. Alternative timelines, where different choices had been made, different paths had been followed, different relationships between the town and the flow of time had been established. Room 847 contained a mirror that showed Millbrook Valley as it existed before the Morrison factory was built, when the land had been farmland and forest, when Native American trails had crossed where Main Street now ran, when the only buildings had been a trading post and a small church that served families scattered across the rural landscape. Horse-drawn carriages moved along dirt roads. Children in knickers played with wooden hoops and sticks. Women in long dresses hung laundry on lines that stretched between trees that had been cut down. Decades before the Morrison factory had even been planned, the reflection was so detailed, so vivid, that visitors could almost smell the wood smoke from chimneys, almost hear the sound of axes biting into timber, almost feel the rhythm of a life that moved according to seasons and weather, rather than clocks and schedules. Some people reported that they could step through the mirror into that earlier version of the valley, that they could walk among the settlers and farmers who had established the first community on this land, that they could experience what life had been like when time moved according to natural rhythms rather than industrial demands. Room 23's mirror revealed the town as it might have been if the accident had never happened. Modern buildings that had been constructed according to plans that were never implemented. Chain stores that had never received permission to build. Traffic lights that had never been installed because the population had never grown large enough to require them. It was a version of Millbrook Valley that had continued to exist in normal time, that had maintained its connection to the outside world, that had grown and changed and evolved according to the same patterns that shaped other American small towns. This reflected reality. The Morrison factory had been demolished in the 1980s and replaced by a shopping center. The high school had been expanded twice to accommodate growing enrollment. The hospital had added a new wing and acquired modern equipment. Young people had stayed in town instead of leaving for college and never returning, creating a community that balanced tradition with progress, that honored its past while building its future. The most dangerous mirror was in room 1456, according to Catherine's whispered warnings. "That one shows you what you would have been," she said, her voice dropping to barely audible levels, as if speaking too loudly about the mirror might attract its attention, might cause it to show things that were better left unseen. If you had left town before the accident, if you had never come here at all, if you had made different choices at crucial moments in your life. Some people spent hours staring into that mirror, watching the lives they never got to live, seeing themselves in careers they never pursued, in relationships they never formed, in places they never visited, in versions of themselves that had developed according to different influences, different opportunities, different accidents of timing and circumstance. The mirror showed not just alternative versions of individual lives, but alternative versions of entire family trees, showing children who had never been born, grandchildren who would never exist, legacies that would never be created. We've had guests check into that room and never check out, Catherine continued, her eyes avoiding direct contact, as if the memory of those disappearances was too painful to face directly. Not because they died, but because they chose to live. In the reflection instead of reality, they found versions of themselves that they preferred, lives that seemed more satisfying, relationships that felt more fulfilling. And they just ... stepped through, became part of the reflection instead of part of our world. The third floor's windows looked out onto different times of day simultaneously, creating a chronological impossibility that somehow felt natural, inevitable, correct. The east windows showed sunrise, the golden light of morning streaming across a landscape that suggested endless possibility. The kind of light that made people believe in fresh starts and new beginnings. South windows displayed noon, harsh and bright and honest, showing everything clearly without the softening effects of shadows or atmospheric filtering. West windows revealed sunset, the warm colors of evening that made everything look romantic and nostalgic, that transformed even ordinary moments into memories worth preserving. North windows were locked in midnight, showing the valley under starlight that somehow included constellations from different seasons, different years, different centuries, as if all the night skies that had ever been visible from this location were somehow present simultaneously. But the views weren't from the same day or even the same year. Each window captured a specific moment in the town's history, frozen and displayed like scenes in a museum diorama, like exhibits in a collection that documented how the same place could look completely different depending on when you observed it, how time could transform landscapes while leaving them essentially unchanged. In the town hall, voices echoed conversations that hadn't happened yet, creating a temporal dissonance that challenged basic assumptions about cause and effect, about the relationship between questions and answers, about the linear progression that most people accepted as the natural order of human communication. Major William Foster, who had been in office since 1974 and who somehow continued to govern a municipality that no state agency recognized, conducted meetings where participants responded to questions before he asked them, where discussions concluded, before topics were introduced, where decisions were made before problems were identified. The minutes from these sessions, meticulously recorded by his secretary Linda Rodriguez, in handwriting that remained consistent despite the temporal confusion of the conversations she was documenting, read like abstract poetry, answers without questions, responses to statements not yet made, agreements to proposals still forming in the mayor's mind, solutions to problems that hadn't been articulated but that everyone somehow understood needed to be solved. The budget committee will approve the library expansion, said Robert Hayes during a January meeting, according to minutes that Linda had typed on a manual typewriter that somehow still received ribbons despite no office supply store acknowledging orders from Millbrook Valley. His statement was recorded at the top of page 3, followed by detailed discussion of implementation strategies, funding sources, and construction timelines. 3 paragraphs later, Mayor Foster proposed expanding the library to accommodate the town's growing collection of materials that documented events that had never been officially recorded, books that had been donated by publishers who had no record of making the donations, periodicals that arrived by mail from subscription, services that showed no record of payment from the town. 4 pages later, the budget committee was formed. Its members appointed from a list of volunteers who had somehow expressed interest in serving before the committee had been conceived, who had already prepared reports about funding strategies for projects that hadn't been ascribed to them, who had developed expertise in municipal finance despite working in jobs that no tax authority recognized, earning income that no payroll service processed. The conversation flowed backwards and forwards through time, participants existing in multiple moments simultaneously, their contributions to the discussion arriving from different periods in the meeting's temporal structure, but somehow creating a coherent narrative, a logical progression of municipal decision-making that achieved practical results despite its chronological impossibility. "We need to address the water main issue on Elm Street," Linda would say, her voice carrying the urgency of someone reporting a crisis that required immediate attention. 20 minutes later, in the meeting's official timeline, Mayor Foster would mention that he'd received complaints about water pressure, setting up the context for Linda's earlier statement, creating a cause and effect relationship that moved backwards through time but forward through logic. The town's church bells chimed when no one was near the bell tower, when the mechanism that controlled their ringing showed no signs of recent activation, when even the most careful observation revealed no human agency in their operation. Father Michael Santos, who had served the community since 1971, and who somehow continued to conduct services that no denomination officially recognized, explained that the bells rang to mark moments that mattered to the town's collective memory, events that resonated through the community's shared experience, regardless of when they occurred in linear time. They chime for births, deaths, marriages, significant events, he said, his voice carrying the gentle authority of someone who had spent decades helping people navigate the mysteries of faith and existence. But they also chime for moments that will matter, events that haven't happened yet, but will be important when they do. The bells exist in all of time simultaneously, just like we do. They can hear the future approaching just as clearly as they remember the past receding. The bell tower itself defied architectural logic, rising higher than the church's exterior. Dimensions suggested was possible, reaching toward a sky that showed different weather patterns depending on which window you looked through. From the east side, clear blue skies that promised perfect days for outdoor activities. From the west, storm clouds that suggested the kind of dramatic weather that made people grateful for shelter and community. During Sunday services, the congregation sang hymns in harmonies that included voices from people not present, creating musical arrangements that were richer and more complex than the visible participants could produce. The choir consisted of 12 living members, but the sound that filled the sanctuary contained dozens of voices, past choir members who had died, but whose voices remained embedded in the church's acoustic memory, future members who hadn't been born yet, but whose musical contributions were somehow already part of the congregation's worship. The harmonies were perfect, each voice finding its proper place in arrangements that had been developed over decades of collaborative music making that transcended normal temporal boundaries. Children's voices blended with adult voices, soprano lines interwove with bass parts, creating musical textures that suggested a community much larger than the one that was physically present, but exactly the size of the one that existed across all the years since the accident. Phone conversations in Millbrook Valley often included participants from different time periods, creating discussions that bridged decades of the town's history, that allowed people to communicate across the gaps that normally separated past from present from future. Linda Rodriguez showed me transcripts of calls where she spoke with the previous mayor, who had died in 1978, about policies that wouldn't be implemented until the 1990s, about challenges that hadn't been identified yet, but that would require attention when they arose. The conversations were perfectly normal, except for their temporal impossibility. The previous mayor's voice came through clearly, without the distortion that usually characterized supernatural communication in ghost stories and horror movies. He discussed budget allocations, personnel decisions, infrastructure improvements with the same practical focus he had brought to municipal governance during his lifetime, contributing his experience to problems that would arise long after his death. Time isn't linear when you're living in all of it at once, Linda explained, her teacher's voice carrying the patience of someone who had explained this concept many times before to people who were struggling to understand how reality could work differently from what they had been taught to expect. We exist in a bubble where past, present, and future are all equally present, all equally real, all equally accessible. So naturally, our conversations reflect that reality. I can discuss lesson plans for next semester with a student who graduated 20 years ago. Makes perfect sense from our perspective. The old payphone outside the gas station sometimes received calls from people who had never lived in Millbrook Valley, but who would have if circumstances had been different, if choices had been made differently, if the accident had never happened and the town had continued to exist in normal time. These calls were always brief, confused voices asking directions to places that didn't exist, looking for people who had never been born, trying to reach a version of the town that existed only in possibility. The conversations were poignant, in their impossibility, reflecting the connections that might have been formed if time had moved differently. If the town had continued to grow and change and attract new residents, if the isolation created by the accident had never occurred. People called looking for jobs that were never posted, apartments that were never built, relatives who had never moved to a place that had become unstuck from normal time. James Parker, who, in addition to operating the hotel elevator, also maintained the payphone as a kind of community service that no telephone company acknowledged, kept a log of these impossible calls. The notebook contained hundreds of entries spanning decades, documenting attempts at communication that crossed temporal boundaries, that originated from alternative versions of reality where different choices had created different outcomes. The guest book at Thomas Hartwell's Historical Society contained my signature on page 847, written in my handwriting, dated September 12, 1967. I was born in 1985. The signature appeared genuine. The ink aged appropriately for something that had been exposed to light and air for over 50 years. The penmanship unmistakably mine, despite the chronological impossibility of my having existed to write it. Below my name, a note in my handwriting that I didn't remember writing, but that expressed thoughts I recognized as my own, came looking for answers about the newspaper clippings, found questions I never knew to ask. The entry was surrounded by other signatures from visitors who had arrived across the decades, each one dated with precision, each one representing someone who had discovered Millbrook Valley and had been discovered by it in return. Some names appeared multiple times, dated years or decades apart, suggesting repeat visits by people who had found something in the town that drew them back repeatedly. that answered needs they couldn't satisfy anywhere else. Thomas watched me study the impossible signature with the calm expression of someone who had witnessed similar revelations countless times, who had learned to accept the extraordinary as simply another variation in the pattern of human experience, another way. That reality could arrange itself around human need and desire and curiosity. Time moves in circles here, he said, his historian's voice carrying the authority of someone who had spent decades documenting phenomena that challenged conventional understanding of how existence was supposed to work. Linear progression is a luxury for places that exist in normal reality, where cause follows effect in predictable sequences, where yesterday leads to today, leads to tomorrow in orderly fashion. We exist in all our moments simultaneously, past visits, current visits, future visits. Your signature has been in that book for 56 years because part of you has always been coming here. He showed me other entries, other signatures that predated the people who had supposedly written them. Other evidence that the town existed in a temporal relationship that allowed effects to precede causes, that permitted visitors to arrive before they had decided to make the journey. That enabled documentation to exist before the events it documented had occurred. The ballroom at the Millbrook Inn played the same song every evening at exactly 9:15 p.m. The Way You Look Tonight, performed by a band that had died in the Morrison factory accident, their instruments somehow continuing to produce music despite the absence of living musicians to play them. But the dancers weren't ghosts in any traditional sense. They were living residents of the town, people who had survived the accident and continued to age and live and work and love in the decades since, moving to music played by deceased musicians, repeating the same dance from April 14th, 1975, the last night before the accident changed everything. Sarah Mitchell danced with Dr. Benjamin Cross, both of them exactly as they appeared on that final night of normalcy. But Sarah was simultaneously the young woman from 1975 and the elderly woman from 2023, existing in both moments without contradiction, without any sense that the temporal impossibility created problems that needed to be solved. The dance was memory made physical, the past playing itself out in an eternal present that honored what had been lost while celebrating what had survived. We dance every night, Sarah explained during a break in the music, her voice carrying the matter-of-fact tone of someone describing a beloved routine, a ritual that provided comfort and continuity in a world that had been fundamentally disrupted. Same song, same steps, same partners. Not because we're trapped, but because that was the last perfect moment, before we knew what was coming, before everything changed, before we learned what it meant to exist without official recognition. The dance preserved that innocence, that joy, that sense of possibility that ended at 9:17 a.m. on April 15th, 1975. When the Morrison factory explosion killed 23 people and severed the town's connection to normal time. The dancers moved with the grace and enthusiasm of people who believed in the future, who trusted that tomorrow would bring opportunities for growth and change and happiness, who had no reason to suspect that their community was about to be deleted from official reality. The town's children aged and grew up, developing through normal stages of physical and emotional development, but they remained children in their school pictures, their class photos showing them year after year without advancing to the next grade, without graduating and moving on to high schools and colleges and careers in the outside world. Linda Rodriguez showed me class photos spanning 5 decades, the same children appearing year after year, growing older but never graduating, learning lessons but never moving to the next stage of their educational journey. Time allows them. Too mature, she said, her teacher's instincts evident in the way she spoke about her students, with the mixture of professional concern and personal affection that characterized educators who truly cared about the young people in their charge. They develop intellectually, emotionally, physically, just like children everywhere. But they don't move forward in the linear sense. They're 20, 30, 40 years old now, but they're still in Mrs. Peterson's third grade class from 1976, still learning multiplication tables and cursive writing, still experiencing the wonder of discovering how the world works. The children themselves didn't seem disturbed by their situation. They approached their eternal education with the enthusiasm that characterized childhood learning at its best, finding joy in discovery, excitement in mastering new skills, satisfaction in understanding concepts that had previously confused them. They were simultaneously children and adults, innocent and experienced, new to the world and deeply familiar with its patterns. Records showed births, deaths, marriages, divorces, all the milestones of normal life that communities experience as they evolve through time. But the residents also appeared in documentation from before their births, after their deaths, during periods when they lived elsewhere, creating personal histories that defied chronological logic but that felt emotionally authentic, that honored the complexity of human experience across temporal boundaries. Thomas Hartwell's files contained marriage certificates for couples who had never met, at least not in linear time, whose relationships existed in the spaces between documented moments. Death certificates for people who were still alive, still working, still contributing to the community's daily life. Birth certificates for children who had never been conceived according to normal biological processes, but who had been born into the town's collective consciousness, who had become part of the community's extended family through mechanisms that transcended physical reproduction. Linear time is an illusion, Thomas said, pulling out a file folder labeled with my name in the same handwriting that had signed the guest book decades before my birth. Inside, documentation spanning decades of connection to Millbrook Valley that I had no memory of creating. School records from schools I'd never attended. Employment history from jobs I'd never held. Medical records from Dr. Cross, who had died when I was 8 years old, but who had somehow been treating me for ailments I'd never experienced in a town I'd never visited until today. The documentation was thorough, detailed, consistent with the kind of records that accumulate around any person who lives in a community for an extended period. Report cards that showed my academic progress through grades I'd never completed. Tax records that documented income from work I'd never performed. Voter registration that indicated participation in elections I'd never heard of for offices that didn't exist in normal reality. You've been part of Millbrook Valley's story much longer than you realize. Thomas continued, his voice carrying the gentle authority of someone who had learned to help people understand truths that challenged their fundamental assumptions about reality. This visit isn't your first, it's your most recent. You've been coming here for decades, contributing to our community, participating in our life, helping us maintain our connection to the outside world even as that world forgot we existed. I left Millbrook Valley on a Tuesday morning, driving the same road that had brought me there, following the GPS directions that would lead me back to the interstate highway system, back to the documented world where towns appeared on official maps and residents carried identification that was recognized by government agencies. The morning air was crisp with the promise of autumn, though my car's thermometer still reads summer temperatures, though the calendar on my phone insisted it was mid-July. rather than the September that the lights suggested. The GPS recalculated. As I drove, showing the route I expected, interstate highways marked with familiar numbers, recognizable exit signs that would lead to cities I could find on any atlas. The normal geometry of American roads that connected documented places to other documented places in patterns that made logical sense. In my rearview mirror, the town shrank and faded according to the normal rules of perspective and distance, the buildings becoming smaller as I moved away from them, the details blurring as the space between us increased, until Millbrook Valley disappeared completely behind a curve in the road, leaving only empty fields and telephone poles and the kind of rural landscape that characterized the spaces between more significant places. I drove for 3 hours, listening to radio stations that played familiar songs by recognizable artists, that featured advertisements for products I could buy in stores I could locate, that announced news about events occurring in places that appeared on maps. The highway signs counted down miles to cities I had visited before, destinations where I could find hotels that accepted credit cards issued by banks that existed in official reality, restaurants that paid taxes to governments that acknowledged their operation. 3 hours later, I was parking outside the Millbrook Public Library again. The clock on my dashboard read 9:32 a.m. I had left at 9:30 a.m. Eleanor Whitmore smiled from behind the circulation desk, her silver hair perfectly styled, her cardigan the color of autumn leaves, her expression carrying the patient warmth of someone who had been expecting me to return, who had been waiting for me to complete a cycle that she understood better than I did. "Welcome back," she said, her voice carrying no surprise, no confusion about my reappearance. No need for explanation about how I had managed to drive for 3 hours and arrive 2 minutes after I had left. You were gone for quite a while this time. How was the outside world? I checked my watch, compared it to my phone, looked at the clock on the library wall. All showed the same time. 9:32 a.m. on the same Tuesday when I had begun my departure. The coffee I had purchased at a gas station 50 miles away was still warm in the cup holder. The radio was still playing the same song that had been on when I drove away from the library parking lot. This happens sometimes, Eleanor explained, stamping a return date into a book that had been checked out in 1987 but was somehow still generating late fees that no patron would ever be required to pay, because no financial institution would process payments from Millbrook Valley residents. The town exists in a bubble, but bubbles are closed systems by definition. What enters tends to stay, even when it appears to leave. You can drive away, fly away, walk away. People have tried every method of departure you can imagine, but you'll always arrive back here, usually within a few hours of when you left, sometimes within a few minutes. She showed me a logbook that documented departure and arrival times for visitors across the decades, creating a record of temporal impossibilities that had become routine administrative data. People left at 3:47 p.m. and returned at 3:51 p.m. after driving for days. Others departed at sunrise and returned at sunrise after walking across multiple states, their odometers showing hundreds of miles of travel, their memories full of landscapes and conversations and experiences that had somehow been compressed into moments that registered as zero, elapsed time on the town's clocks. The motel registry no longer contained my name, though I clearly remembered checking in, remembered the key to room 15, remembered the view from the window that had showed different seasons depending on the time of day. The room I had occupied showed no signs of my presence. The bed was made with military precision. The towels were folded exactly as housekeeping had left them. The complimentary soap remained unwrapped in its paper packaging. My car wasn't in the motel parking lot where I had left it the night before. It was outside the library, exactly where I had first parked when I arrived in town. With the same amount of gas despite the 3 hours of driving, the same mileage despite the hundreds of miles the odometer should have recorded, the same coffee stain on the passenger seat that had been there when I first discovered the road that led to Millbrook Valley. James Parker, at the gas station, filled my tank and charged me the same amount as before, his movements suggesting routine rather than repetition, the kind of practiced efficiency that develops in people who have been performing the same service for decades. "Funny thing about gas here," he said, hanging up the nozzle with the careful precision of someone who took pride in maintaining equipment that no inspection service had certified, no insurance company had covered, never seems to get used up. Cars run on fumes that somehow never empty, just like people here live on time that never runs out. We exist in a kind of perpetual, almost empty, that never quite becomes actually empty. My cell phone showed no record of calls I remembered making, photos I remembered taking, messages I remembered sending to people in the outside world who would never receive them because the communication infrastructure that connected Millbrook Valley to the rest of reality only worked in one direction, only allowed information to enter the town, never to leave it. The voice memos I had recorded, hours of interviews with residents, documentation of impossible phenomena, notes to myself about discoveries that had challenged my understanding of how time and place and human community could function, were replaced by a single recording of my own voice saying words I didn't remember speaking. The newspaper clippings stop in 1975, but the town remembers everything after. This is my story. This is how I became part of their story. The notebook I had filled with observations, questions, theories, and documentation was blank, except for one entry on the first page, written in my handwriting but in ink that looked aged, as if it had been written years ago by someone trying to remember how to form letters, how to translate thoughts into words, how to document experiences that defied documentation. Arrived in Millbrook Valley, population unknown, time of departure to be determined. The entry was dated with today's date, but the ink had the faded quality that indicated years of exposure to light and air. The paper had the slight yellowing that suggested age. The handwriting had the careful quality that characterized important documents, records that were meant to be preserved, statements that were intended to last longer than the people who wrote them. Thomas Hartwell found me sitting on the library steps, staring at the empty notebook, trying to understand how 3 hours of careful documentation could disappear while leaving behind evidence that it had once existed. That someone who looked like me and wrote like me had been recording observations about a place that officially didn't exist. "The outside world forgets," he said gently, settling beside me on the stone steps with the careful movements of someone whose bones had been carrying the weight of decades, whose body had been aging normally even while existing in a place where time moved in circles rather than lines. That's how the loop maintains itself. You can leave physically, but your experience here becomes part of the town's memory instead of your own. The story continues, but you become part of it rather than its narrator. He showed me other notebooks, other documentation created by visitors who had tried to record their experiences in Millbrook Valley, who had attempted to document the impossible phenomena they witnessed, who had hoped to carry evidence back to the outside world that would prove the town's existence, that would restore its connection to official reality. All the notebooks were blank except for single entries similar to mine, all written in different handwriting but expressing similar thoughts, similar confusion, similar recognition that something important was happening, but that the importance existed beyond the reach of normal documentation. The town preserves what matters, Thomas continued, his historian's training evident in the way he organized complex information, the way he helped people understand patterns that weren't immediately obvious. Your observations, your insights, your unique perspective on our situation, all of that becomes part of our collective memory. We remember your questions, your theories, your attempts to understand what we've become. But the outside world can't retain that information. It would create paradoxes, contradictions, challenges to the official version of reality that the documented world needs to maintain its stability. Some places don't haunt you, they absorb you. They take your story and make it part of their larger narrative, weaving your experience into their eternal present until you can't tell where you end and they begin, until your individual existence becomes a thread in a tapestry that's been growing for decades. That includes hundreds of people who have discovered this place where time moves differently, where community exists without official recognition, where human connection transcends the boundaries that normally separate past from present from. Future Millbrook Valley isn't a town trapped in time. It's a town where time has become elastic, where all moments exist simultaneously, where the past and future collapse into an endless present tense now that accommodates every experience, every memory, every possibility that has ever been associated with this place. The residents don't live in 1975. They live in all the years since 1975, simultaneously and completely, experiencing their entire timeline as a single extended moment that includes everything they've ever been and everything they're still becoming. The newspaper clippings stop in 1975 because that's when the town stopped needing external validation for its existence, when it learned to document itself through memory and relationship and shared experience rather than through official records. That required outside agencies to acknowledge their legitimacy. The residents continue living, aging, loving, dying, and being born because life doesn't require official recognition to be real, because human communities can exist in the spaces between documented moments, because the most important aspects of existence, love, friendship, creativity, hope, sorrow, joy, don't need government approval to happen. They exist in the spaces between recorded moments, in the gaps where history forgot to pay attention, in the silence between the last newspaper's printing and the next edition that will never come. Because the outside world has moved on to other stories, other communities, other concerns that seem more pressing than maintaining connection to a place that time abandoned, but that never abandoned its commitment to human community. I'm writing this from Sarah's Corner Diner, where the coffee is always fresh and the conversations span 5 decades, where people discuss their lives with the kind of honesty that develops in communities where everyone knows everyone else's story, where privacy is less important than connection, where the small details of daily existence become part of a shared narrative that includes everyone who has ever called this place home. Eleanor is saving my research materials at the library, filing them next to documentation from visitors who came before me and visitors who haven't arrived yet, creating an archive that exists outside normal chronological order, but that maintains perfect organization, according to principles that honor human curiosity and the desire to understand experiences, that challenge conventional assumptions about reality. Thomas is adding my story to his collection. Another thread in the tapestry of a town that time abandoned but never forgot. Another voice in the chorus of people who have discovered that existence is more flexible than most places allow. That communities can function according to different rules than the ones that govern officially recognized municipalities. That human connection can transcend the boundaries that normally separate documented reality from lived experience. The question isn't whether Millbrook Valley exists. It's whether existence requires acknowledgement from a world that has moved on. Whether reality needs official recognition to be real. Whether communities have the right to continue existing even after history stops paying attention to them. The residents dance to music played by dead musicians. Conduct business with banks that don't recognize their transactions. Raise children who age but never graduate, and live full lives in a place that officially ended in 1975, but that has never stopped being home to people who found something here that they couldn't find anywhere else. They're not ghosts in any traditional sense. They're simply living in a different relationship with time than the rest of us, experiencing all their moments simultaneously instead of sequentially, existing in a present tense that includes past and future, that honors what was while remaining open to what might be. The newspaper clippings stop, but the story continues. The outside world forgets, but the town remembers. And sometimes, if you take the wrong road at the right moment, if you're open to experiences that challenge your assumptions about how reality works, you become part of what they remember. The town doesn't trap people, it welcomes them. It offers them the chance to exist in a place where human connection matters more than official documentation, where community support is more important than government recognition, where the quality of relationships determines the value of existence, rather than the quantity of official records that prove you have the right to be alive. Subscribe to the Creepy Journal before you find yourself driving down a road that doesn't exist on any map, toward a town that officially ended decades ago but keeps writing its story in the spaces between documented moments, in the gaps where official history stopped paying attention but where human life continued with the same intensity, the same complexity, the same beauty that characterizes existence everywhere. Hit that notification bell, because some stories only find you when you're ready to become part of them, when you're prepared to question whether the official version of reality is the only version worth living, when you're open to the possibility that the most important experiences happen in places that don't appear on maps, in communities that exist without permission, in moments that occur between the seconds the clocks are designed to measure. And remember, time is more flexible than we pretend. Reality is more accommodating than we assume, and some places exist in the gaps where official history stopped paying attention, but where human stories continue to unfold with the same drama, the same meaning, the same capacity to transform the people who experience them that has always characterized the most significant moments in any life. The newspaper clippings stop in 1975, but the town remembers everything after, including you, including the moment when you realize that documentation and existence are different things, that official recognition and authentic experience follow different rules, that the most important stories are often the ones that never make it into the historical record, but that shape the people who lived them in ways that last longer than any newspaper ever could, including the moment when you understand that you've always been part of this story, that your arrival here wasn't an accident but a recognition, that the road that led you to Millbrook Valley was always going to lead you here because some connections transcend the normal relationship between cause and effect, because some communities exist in the spaces between documented time where all possibilities remain open, where every story that was ever started gets the chance to find its proper ending.